Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. As you can hear, my voice is still not back to normal, so I apologize in advance. But I do want to thank our guest, Jennifer Gardner, to talk a bit about power, authority, emotional intelligence, and all these kinds of things around, mostly related to executives at nonprofits, but obviously this applies to everybody as well. So, Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Hi, Alex. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and to have this conversation with you today.
Me too. This is also a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart. So I was hoping that you could begin by telling people, a bit about who you are and what you do for those who have not heard of you before.
Sure. Well, professionally, I was trained to be a lawyer, and then I became a trial lawyer because I thought that was like the best way, the best kind of lawyer to be. It's what I dreamed of. If I was going to be a lawyer, I always believed, well, you've got to be a trial lawyer. You're not a real lawyer. Um, and I've been practicing law here in Los Angeles for 3 decades, focusing primarily on business and real estate disputes, but I also did some criminal defense of some pretty serious cases. And I've experimented with a lot of different practice areas, but these days I am focused on real estate and business disputes. And I also work with high performers. Sometimes they're the heads of nonprofits and they have to deal with issues such as fundraising, for example. I deal with lawyers and leaders in the Fortune 1000 space about how to be more compelling communicators. And so, what that means is how to be more magnetic, how to create a message that's going to inspire and cause other people to want to say yes to them, to want to follow them. It's a really important skill, and it's one that I have great interest in. And how I got to my fascination of studying this was that I had very little formal training in being a successful trial attorney. I started my own practice at a very young age, and I had no idea how to try a case, but my clients all wanted trials, and I'd find myself in courtrooms trying cases, absolutely terrified and feeling completely inadequate and ill-equipped to be able to do a good job. And so I ended up doing a very instinctive thing, which is I told excellent stories about what happened. And I had a very good way of relating to all the parties and the witnesses and the jurors and the judge. And I ended up winning my cases that way. And after several years of doing this, I decided to get some advanced training in trial skills. And then I actually started to study more of the neuroscience and the mechanics of connection and emotional intelligence and influence and persuasion. And I'm still doing that today. So that's how I got to where I am.
Yeah, this is a topic, like I said earlier, near and dear to my heart because persuasion, negotiation, influence, these are skills that everybody needs to know to a certain extent, regardless of whatever you do in life. You're always going to try, whether it's your kid or your coworker or your boss, you're always going to try to negotiate and get your way. So I want to make sure we set the platform on the right foot by saying that these are tactics that are being used for good purposes, right? This is not manipulation in a negative sense. This is positive manipulation, positive persuasion to be able to inspire people, in this case, to inspire maybe donors or volunteers or other people, funders, to get behind your mission and support your cause.
Absolutely, 100%. The ethics of persuasion is a very deep topic, one that I sort of stay clear of. I can tell you that as a lawyer, many times you have to represent people who aren't necessarily the morally correct side of the problem. For example, most of my clients look more like Tony Soprano than Mother Teresa. I will tell you that. But as a lawyer, you have an ethical duty to zealously represent them and use whatever persuasive skills that you have within the bounds of the law and within the bounds of what's ethical. Absolutely. And when I consult with people in my consulting practice, I only work with people who I think are well intentioned. I mean, the world has enough bad actors, and there definitely are sociopathic, psychopathic, narcissistic people out there trying to lead movements and nations, and I have no interest in working with them. And yes, it's out there, but I tend to focus on how these skills are required if we want to be a force for good.
Yeah, awesome. I'm happy because you're right. We need more people like that who are using these kinds of abilities for good. And I imagine it must be really interesting to shift from a trial lawyer to someone who is more focused on persuasion, because you're right. That's kind of, and you said even you're kind of thrown into the fire, so to speak, to learn your way. And there, I think there's almost like the level of importance of being able to influence people as a trial lawyer. I mean, it must be one of the most important skills to have because that is what your job is. So you must have learned some really great skills to be able to then do what you need to do and then figure out the rules maybe in a more formal setting and now apply them to again being a force for good.
Absolutely. And, sadly, lawyers are not taught these skills. We're taught to argue and advocate, but not to persuade. We're not taught to be leaders. In fact, I think that many people, not just lawyers, have this very narrow understanding of what a leader is, as if people who run for political office are so-called leaders. But leadership these days is much more broad than just that narrow conception of what it is.
So let's start with some definitions then. When we're looking at emotionally intelligent leaders, EQ, how would you define someone who is an emotionally intelligent leader?
Well, first of all, let's just back up by saying that emotional intelligence is a really underrated quality. However, when the researchers look at the qualities that are possessed by the biggest leaders in the corporate world, for example, they have they're testing really high on the emotional intelligence scale, as high, if not higher, than their IQ, their intellectual intelligence quotient. So we underestimate the importance of emotional intelligence. And I think of emotional intelligence as being soft skills, a set of soft skills. And actually, Daniel Goleman did this research several years ago. It was published by Harvard Business Review Press in 2017. You can get a breakdown of what he coined as the 5 components of emotional intelligence at work. And you'll recognize all of them. I mean, we all have them to certain degrees. And also the good news is that we can all learn them. We can improve each and every single one of these components. So let me list what they are. Number 1, self-awareness. 2, self-regulation. 3, motivation. 4, empathy. And 5, social skill. And I think that they're all important, but the ones that I tend to focus on the most for myself and for my clients are empathy and self-regulation. But you can't have empathy unless you're first self-aware. So to me, self-awareness and empathy sort of go together because you have to be aware of your own feelings to be able to understand the feelings of others.
So there's a couple points. Let's start with you can improve your emotional intelligence. So unlike IQ, which I don't think you can, maybe you can train yourself a little bit, but I don't think IQ changes too much over your lifetime. In your opinion, or based on what you know, like how malleable is EQ? Can someone start off being, poor and become amazing at it? Or are there limits to how much someone can change over a lifetime or improve, I should say, over a lifetime?
I don't know about limits, but I know that there is definitely capacity in the brain to improve EQ and also IQ. I happen to be in a course right now about understanding neuroscience and understanding neuroscience for business, which is being taught through Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania. And one of the topics that we're covering is this concept of neuroplasticity and how malleable our brains are and how they're constantly shifting and changing. And so you can develop these skills if you know what they are and you put certain things into practice, just like you can develop your intellect and sharpen your intellect skills simply by solving puzzles or learning a new language, or all of these things change the structure of the brain without getting too technical and too scientific, because I'm definitely not an expert. I am a student of these ideas, but I can tell you that the brain is a living, breathing, always changing organism. So there's hope. These skills can be learned. We can improve in absolutely every one of the five components of emotional intelligence, as well as our intellect.
You mentioned that there's a prerequisite that self-awareness needs to come first. Is there a particular order to these five things that you generally find? And is self-aware always the prerequisite for the remaining ones? Like you need to have empathy before you have motivation, or self
Mm.
regulation before social skills? Like, is there an order to things, or is it once you have self-awareness, you're able to develop the other four more or less at the same time?
Well, for me personally, and which is confirmed by my work with others and just my work in the world, self-awareness is foundational. Like, how can you be empathic if you can't feel your own feelings, for
Mm.
example, right? So it really does require slowing down and becoming aware of what is happening inside of you internally, right? So that's one really critical factor. I also think that we have to be self-aware so that we can self-regulate. If you're triggered by something and you burst into some angry outburst, perhaps you wouldn't do that if you were aware of what your triggers are and how you respond in similar situations, or why this might be triggering you and affecting you and your mood and your emotions, right? So self-awareness is really, like, for me, foundational. I also think you have to be self-aware of your own feelings and your moods and whatever's affecting you in order to have empathy for other people. That's how we develop compassion. If you're cut off for your own emotions, how can you understand the emotional makeup of other people? So I also think self-awareness is important for social skills, right? How do we know if we are being effective at building and managing relationships if we're out of touch with ourselves and our own internal reactions and processes, right? Because we're constantly getting feedback from how we show up in the world, feedback from other people. So I think that they're all related. And motivation, I feel, is a little bit unrelated to the self awareness piece, but it helps to know, oh, I better be motivated, or I better get motivated, or gee, I'm really motivated and pursuing this thing that interests me. Like, for example, me with the topic of influence and persuasion and power and emotional intelligence and the neuroscience of all of this, right? I'm super motivated to learn. Having said that, late at night, when I'm studying for a class, I still have to motivate myself if I'm tired because I worked really hard that day. But there you go. There you have it.
I, so you mentioned language as a one way to improve um, your brain function, the neuroplasticity of it. I imagine we don't need to go through each one because not be too much content, but let's imagine there must be a couple of exercises or skills or actions that people can take to develop each of these five independently, right?
There are. I mean, the biggest one that I find to be the most effective is to explore where we personally come up against growth edges or feel ourselves are being blocked in community with like-minded people in a safe environment. For me, that is the most effective way to become aware of where we may fall short in one of these categories and to actually work through them. My work with people is in groups, and we're not looking at emotional intelligence per se. We're looking at our feelings of comfort and discomfort around being powerful and asserting ourselves more effectively, if that makes sense.
It does actually, and I that makes total sense, and I completely agree because the times that I find myself growing tend to be the parts that I'm or the moments that I'm pushing my comfort zone. That if I'm in my comfort zone, it's everything's happy and there's rainbows and unicorns, but there isn't much growth happening. And I find, at least personally, the growth, my own personal growth, tends to be at least accelerated um, when I'm outside of my comfort zone or hitting those edges. And then if you keep on doing that, the idea is at some period of time later, years later, you're like, wow, look back at all the things I've done, all the things I've accomplished, all the ways I've grown. And that comfort zone has become so large now that it's very empowering, gives you a lot of self-confidence and awareness, all that kind of stuff as well. So I'm happy to hear that, definitely pushing those comforts. Like if you're hitting a moment where you feel uncomfortable either internally or externally, that's probably a sign of there's some growth to happen or you are growing. Are there normally other signs that you see as well, or is that the majority of cases?
Well, I'm going to speak from personal experience here and say that I've learned the most from my biggest failures.
Mm.
And sometimes they weren't even failures, but things that didn't go right, results I didn't want to have happen. There's all kinds of ways to look at these things, right? It's never black and white in my mind. It's always very nuanced. That's just the way my brain makes sense of the world. But I really feel that failing and having resilience through the experience of failure and the emotional aftermath is required to grow. I really do. I wish it wasn't so. I mean, I think there are other ways to grow too, but I think I've always learned the most from my most devastating disasters. Let's just put it that way. And I haven't had too many of them. I've been fortunate, but when they hit, ooh, I feel them, and they hurt. They're painful. And I think it's really important to be with that feeling and to work through it and push through it. I mean, I've had devastating things happen, and where some people might say, oh, I'm never doing that again. I'm like, I'm getting back on that horse, for example. I've been kicked off a horse. It's been a long time. I'm pretty good at staying on these days, but um, I'm talking more metaphorically about life. I've lost cases that I shouldn't have lost or that I thought I shouldn't have lost, and it made me a better lawyer. And there have been doors that have shut on me and others have opened. But it's through picking up the pieces and carrying on that I became a more evolved human, a wiser human, and a better lawyer.
The expression that I love is it's not how far you fall, but how high you bounce. It goes
I
back to
love that.
resilience of saying, it's a kind of getting back up once you've fallen off the horse, so to speak. But the idea of to me, bouncing, I like that imagery because we will hit, well, we have the capacity to hit bottom, but it's not about staying there. It's about, okay, how do I leapfrog from this position to learn from it, grow from it, become a better person so I don't repeat the same mistakes over and over.
Absolutely.
So now that we've wrapped our head around the concept of EQ and emotional intelligence, how can we then apply it to leaders? And in this context, of course, talking toward nonprofit leaders, executives, like, is there any, like, how would you normally introduce the concept to people who are either unfamiliar of what EQ is, or they're looking to develop their own thing to be able to to forward their own mission?
Well, funny you should ask me that question because I actually teach a course on this and it's called The Power Quotient. And it's where IQ meets EQ for greater sway. And basically what the theory is that I educate my students on is that you need both. You need to be smart, you need to be able to bring the data, and you need to understand the elements of emotional intelligence and exercise them in yourself like a muscle. And this is the way you're going to become the magnetic communicator that you need to be in order to lead, motivate, inspire, and impact other people.
I actually didn't know you had a course. That's awesome. That was a pretty good.
Yeah, it's a good
um,
plug for my course.
there you go.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
let's imagine someone comes to you, they want to start your course, they know about your course, or they're looking for guidance on how to improve their EQ. Are there any trends that you notice, like the first thing we need to work on is X, and then once we get that established, we can focus on, Y and Z and so forth? Is there a particular order, or it's a case by case situation?
Um, there is a specific order. When I work one-on-one with individuals, it's a case-by-case situation. But for purposes of this little mini course that I've created, it's in no particular, well, it is in a specific order, which is I always feel that people are drawn to me because they sense that they can really let their guard down and be themselves with me about how they feel awkward when communicating for various reasons. They're afraid of stumbling and fumbling their words, or they have a difficult time not being triggered by what someone else is saying, or they're uncomfortable being visible when they have to give a presentation, or they have to be interviewed, or they have to do a video for social media, or they have to argue a case or negotiate a difficult position for a client. And almost all of my students and clients are what I would call highly sensitive people. And the first thing that we do is we look at how this emotional sensitivity is a source of strength. It's not a weakness. It's not a weakness for so many reasons. We don't have enough hours or enough minutes on our hour today for me to cover in greater depth or in the necessary amount of depth as to why that is so. But I'm all about understanding how we connect with other humans through our sensitivity, by being sensitive, by feeling things deeply. And we already covered this earlier in this interview when you were asking me questions about empathy. And there's a quote that I'd love to share with your listeners about empathy that relates to two other topics that I'm extremely interested in, which is what mirror neurons are, what's happening between people who are communicating, what's happening on a wavelength, a brain wavelength between two communicators. In the science they call them interlocutors, and synchronicity between humans as they're communicating. So this quote is so beautiful. It's by, I hope I'm not butchering his name, Ryszard Praskier, and it's from a 2014 article entitled Empathy, Mirror Neurons, and Sync from the Mind and Society Journal, Volume 15. And this is the quote. Empathy is an essential part of emotions and is itself a specific emotion involving a feeling element of familiarity or connection and a bodily reaction of verbal and nonverbal communication. Empathy in general would mean feeling what the other person is feeling and being in the shoes of the other. Empathy is closely related to intuition and this is my favorite part of the quote, like intuition, helps in the understanding and recognition of emotions in others. Empathy is thus described as recognizing other people's emotions through intuition and is marked by a feeling of connecting to the other person. So it works the other way too. If you're feeling the other person and you're communicating with them, in sync with them, they are going to feel this and they're going to feel more connected to you. And I believe this is the key to influence. It's the start of building a relationship, which you can do one word, one neuron at a time. And this is the key to being powerful, because when you have influence, when you're connected, you have influence. And when you have influence, you are powerful.
So that's an interesting take. To be sensitive, to have influence, influence to have power. I've heard it differently. I've heard sometimes being vulnerable is a strength. Again, there's a lot we could cover on that one. But I'm more curious to know, because some people think influence is more about maybe an after effect of power. First you get the power, then you can influence people. This flips it around by saying, even more so by saying everything has to start with you first, being sensitive, being empathic, being able to build that connection. Once you have that connection, then you can influence them. And then by doing that makes you powerful. I almost want to, I've seen examples where it's the exact opposite. So I was wondering if you could speak more about those 3 points and how one is required to follow to the next.
That's a really good question. I do believe, though, that when we think in terms of the typical leader, like the politician who excites the crowd and gets all of this support for his ideas and works them up into an enthusiastic frenzy, what are they doing? They're tapping into a universal emotion. And the emotions are contagious. There's such a thing called emotional contagion, right? But people have to, in order to feel this emotional contagion, there has to be an element of shared experience. So a really talented leader is tapping into something in the collective conscious or collective subconscious of a group of people in order to inspire that kind of enthusiasm or support for them and their ideas. Um, so I think that how would a leader know how to do that if they weren't reflective and able to analyze and speak into the needs or the feelings, the fears, the aspirations, the desires of the people that they want to inspire? I think it really does start with an instinctive understanding of the pain that these people are feeling and their vision for the future, how things would improve. If you can articulate that, that's the keys to the kingdom right there. I mean, in my country, we have the president who's able to do that for a vast majority of the people in our country. That says something about them. And he's really, really good. He angers a lot of people, he polarizes, and that's another hallmark of an effective communicator, not being afraid to take a polarizing position. He's not afraid, he does it, and his supporters love him even more. But he's very, very aware of what he needs to say and how he needs to say it in order to generate this kind of support and enthusiasm for him.
I was curious if building authority and credibility follows in this sequence, or is it another path? Like if you have sensitivity and then influence, does influence create powerfulness and authority and or credibility? Or I'm just because I'm a computer guy, right? I'm an engineer at heart. So for me, cause and effect, and what inspires or can is required to be done before you can move on to the next stage is part of the way my brain works apparently. So I'm just curious to know because we also talk about building authority in general, leaders having authority or building authority or trying to build authority and credibility as well too, which I imagine is I don't imagine I know it's related to not lying about what things you say as well. But I'm wondering if there's a connection to those three elements we've spoken about earlier, or those two authority and credibility is completely separate from everything we've talked about so far.
No, it's not separate. It's a very important part of it. I really do believe, and the research supports that you need both. You need data and you need the connection in order to build credibility and authority. The data helps build credibility and authority. And it really is a matter of both. The data is going to go to the left side of the brain, which is the more linear thinking side of the brain. But it's the emotional part of the brain on the right side that overrules the left side and makes the decision. So if you have good support for your ideas, good data that supports your ideas, and then you know how to push the buttons on an emotional level for the people that you're speaking to, that's golden. You're golden. You have a really good shot at getting enough votes, approval, yes, money, sales, the client, the case, whatever it is you're trying to win.
So nice. I like that point. It's the data, tomato, tomato, that allows you to do that. So it's a combination of the two that really is that 1-2 punch. So let's then tie it back to a nonprofit leader, for example, right? They're trying to inspire people to invoke certain emotions that get people riled up in terms of what the nonprofit can achieve. What are maybe some strategies or tactics that they can apply to put this all into practice? Let's say, for example, they need to either get more money, raise, do fundraising, or get more volunteers to contribute toward a particular event. Like, is there a recipe basically, given all these individual ingredients that we can put together in certain quantities at certain moments to be able to get the desired results?
I love that question. I think so. I think that a nonprofit leader needs to be able to have the data that supports the work they're trying to promote, right? Like why, if we support this cause and we do what we're proposing we're going to do, how this will address a really serious problem that exists out there in the world right now, right? So you're going to look at the problem, and then you're going to look at how what it is you want to do has helped solve that problem or has the potential to solve that problem, and why, looking at data like scientific studies, research studies, or what's actually happened in the world that you've happened to study or experience. And in that regard, you can drill down even further and get into a specific case study, like a person or an individual or a group of people or a condition in the world that's been helped by your work, right? And all the benefits that happen, like their before and their after, showing the transformation that they went through. And maybe even drill down further and tell a very emotional story about the lives that the cause is impacting. And I mean, we could spend hours talking about the elements of compelling storytelling. There's certainly a lot of content out there on the internet and in the podcast world about how to do that. It's really an art. It's really an art. And story is a great way to tap into the right side of the brain and get people to feel the way you want them to feel if you can tell the story well. But those are the three things: data, case study, story. I really think that if a nonprofit fundraiser or leader can tap into those things in a compelling presentation, they're going to succeed.
This is the first time I've heard that a story is less about the data and more about the emotional side of things. And I was under the impression previous to that that yes, of course, you need to have that emotional component to a story and a relatability to it as well. I would have thought, or I did think, I should say, that the data kind of reinforces the story. It provides credibility more to the story versus just solely focusing on the emotional side of things. Like, I guess the question I'm trying to ask is data really separate from stories, and that you need all three, the case studies, the data, and the stories, and each one has its own merits on its own without needing from the other?
I would answer that question yes, in my experience. And I think it's the other way around. I think that the data provides you with legitimacy,
Mm.
provided that you're being intellectually honest, right? You're describing your own experience or your own research results, or you cite to the authority that supports what your conclusions are, right? That automatically boosts your credibility right there. And then the story is what drives it home. And remember, the story is the piece that's going to connect with the right side of the brain, which is where emotions fire and where decisions are ultimately made. So if you can start with a foundation of a lot of data and then illustrate with a story that is told in a compelling way that takes people on a journey, a compelling journey where they're really feeling the highs and the lows of the protagonist of the story, the hero of the story. I think that in my experience as a witness to people who are really professional at presenting that way, and in my own experience with having to try cases and explain things to judges and juries all the time, and even to my adversaries. This is really the key. It starts with solid data, and then you go from there to story. Now, when you're crafting your presentation, you may begin with a story, but you have to have all of those elements, I think, in order to succeed.
There's a scenario I was thinking of as you were talking. So, quick background is I have built an application built on top of Salesforce, which is a CRM. And I had a competitor of mine building a very similar application, doing the same thing. And we were both presenting to an audience of other Salesforce consultants. And the approach that we both took was very dramatically different. Very dramatically. I don't know why I said both, but
Mhm.
dramatically for sure. And the idea is that when I started talking about the features and the functionality of the app and what you can do with it and what you can't do with it. And they started with a story. How, not even necessarily how their app helped, but more the kinds of people that they work with and are inspired by. And what I found interesting, because I'm obviously a bit biased, but I felt my functionality of my app was stronger and it had more. But even though theirs wasn't, I actually at the like after the end of it, and even a day later, I remember that story much more than some of the things that I even said. So I guess it's a testament to how powerful these things are. And even I know marketing uses it all the time, right? Focus not on the features, but what it does for your audience. But I guess I was taken back in that moment how powerful it really is and how much I underestimated it. So it kind of, I guess, proves the point you just made.
If you are ever interested in consulting with me about your presentation, feel free to call. I'm here to help.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of AI, I do like talking about AI and how it impacts various elements of our world. How does it? I mean, we're talking a lot about emotional intelligence, which I don't think AI is quite there yet. But I know it can help sometimes write stories or analyze data. How, in general, have you found AI to influence this world that you are helping?
I'm just now beginning to experiment with AI myself. And I
Mm.
am experimenting and I'm having a lot of fun with it. And I find that it's a great time saver. It can make me more efficient. Um, I'm really enjoying my experience with AI, but I don't think that it's going to be a substitute for human to human interaction. And in fact, I feel like the more AI and the machines come for the thinking jobs, the more important the feeling jobs and the ability to use soft skills is going to be. There's always going to be a human intelligence factor. And I think that as we're interacting more and more with AI applications, we're going to need more and more the human interaction. And so being able to understand how to optimize your communication with other humans is has never been more important. Also, simply to distinguish yourself from the robots, right? I kind of need to know what is going to help me. Because, like, why would a person come to me if they can just type their query into Gemini or Claude or ChatGPT or whatever application? In fact, a lot of people, they call me for legal consultations and they'll say, oh, I researched this and I researched that and I used ChatGPT and it says blah, 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 blah. I actually had a call like that this morning and I had to tell this person, look, it's a lot more nuanced than that. There's a lot more to it than that. I mean, AI, maybe it'll get there, but it isn't there now. And don't rely on it for legal advice because it does a lot of hallucinating and not if you got to check absolutely everything that it says. The bottom line is the human intelligence factor and the emotional people skills that we need in order to lead satisfying, productive lives, I think is going to become even more valuable as AI develops. Did I answer your question? I'm not sure I did.
Absolutely. And actually, I would underline um, the what AI tends to do. I noticed, and there's articles about it, even I read this today too, how it loses a bit of the nuance, that it paints things with a big brush stroke, and you lose a bit about the, I wouldn't say human element, but you lose some of the details that actually help you understand a certain concept. It was basically an AI that was summarizing a conversation between multiple people. And it's only by reading some of those conversation points and even some of the ones that were not like points and counterpoints and other concepts, this and that. And the AI was just summarizing it to a point where it's not nearly as useful. So, in addition to the hallucinations and the challenges that AI has, part of the details get lost along the way. And sometimes those details are actually quite important.
I totally agree. I mean, sometimes I'll take something that I've written that's many, many, many thousands of words and pages, and I've plugged it into Claude and asked Claude to sort of summarize it for me so that I can summarize it for somebody else because it just feels like so unwieldy. And the summary that I get back is so vanilla. And I'm
Mhm.
pretty good at prompts, right? At educate like I'm teaching Claude how to speak in my voice, and I'm still not thrilled. Like I'm still a little bit disappointed. So I 1,000% agree with what you just said.
Jennifer, I know we can talk a lot about this. I want to make sure we respect your time, and I might actually reach out to you as well. So, how do people get in touch with you to find out more information about your courses? I know you're writing a book as well, and just get in touch with you in general.
You can find me at I am Jennifer B. Gardner on Instagram, Jennifer B. Gardner on LinkedIn, and my website is jenniferbgardner.com. So if you remember my name, you can search for me and you will find me.
Any about the course and the book? Any comments on those?
Oh,
Or is it
absolutely.
too early
Well,
to, you don't want to share what you need to share? I mean, I know that you mentioned it earlier, if it's a bit too early, but maybe that might help you. Yeah.
the book is in the works. The book is still sort of a concept that I'm playing with, but my course material is very, very real. And the power quotient is going to be a very affordable um, hour-long course geared for everybody, lawyers and non-lawyers. And it's really giving an overview of some really important insights into how to communicate with others in a way that's going to really affect them, where they can really feel you. So, in order to get notice about that, I would say go on my website and opt in to receive my newsletter, which is called The Edge. And that's where I'm going to be announcing to my followers when the course is going to be ready, which should be like any day now. So we're just putting the finishing touches on it.
Awesome. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Alex, for having me. This was fun, challenging conversation, and just really, I love talking about these ideas, and I really appreciate your interest. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing them. All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.